So, yesterday I had a conversation with my dad. Um, he, I, at the time, I was thinking about like a book I'm trying to write, and I was just like, it was about like, you know, a time traveler who gets stuck and in like really far in the past, like a few 100 million years in the past, and um, has to like make its way back to the future, and in the process, like visiting all the different like worlds that Earth has been in, since like the or like since complex multicellular life evolved and all the different worlds that Earth used to be, right? But anyway, um, and he was asked, he saw me reacting a certain way, and he asked me about it. But anyway, um we then started talking about like or well, I started talking about like the origins of like plants and animals and stuff like that. And like so animals, we evolved from sponges, which is, strange. What exactly is a sponge? We have a hard time even classifying it as an animal today, yet everything that is an animal except for comb jellies, which is a whole other thing. Comb jellies are their own like lineage of animals. Technically they were the first animals, and only one like like kind of lineage evolves from comb jellies. It's the ctenophores, which are like, they're basically like, your jellyfish. Not all jellyfish, but like a lot of them, jelly things. But all the rest of animals evolved from sponges. And what a sponge is basically, it's almost like a living rock in a way. Like, it has its own genome and stuff, and it does perform some functions, but like metabolism and all that is all performed by microbes. Like, it doesn't digest its food, and it can grow, but not in the conventional way that animals grow. Almost all of its functions, or at least especially in like the very first sponges, are pretty much all dictated by the microbes that live within it. Like, like how corals um work, but more like more heavy into like the microbe stuff, because corals are a bit different. But anyway, which is really, really weird, you know and it got me thinking about like how you know we, up until like very recently, we never really considered all the microbes that live within us and on us, and our own like human micro environment, and how that affects our biology and health and well-being, and until like very recently. And it turns out that like we can't do a lot of things without our microbes. Like 70% of the things you eat, you can't digest. Your microbes digest it. And there's a bunch of other functions that you need to survive, like, uh like waste disposal, and like enzymes, and a whole cathedral of different things, and so much more that we don't know, of these little microbes and viruses that are actually good for you and perform and live inside you. And when you start to think about the origins of animals, it starts to not look so weird, right? Like, the first thing to ever that was an animal needed that stuff to survive. It was the basis on how it worked. And the same with like plants and fungi. Like, we were talking about how like fungi and plants colonized land, because that was like a time period I really wanted to visit. And there used to be these really like big pillars of fungi, right? And they'd be covered in like lichens, which, if you don't know what a lichen is, it's a symbiotic pair between algae, microbes, and fungi, and like that's how fungi are able to photosynthesize. And also, if you didn't know, the first fungi was about like 1.5 billion-ish years ago, which the first plants and animals were around like 600 million years ago. So that's almost 1 billion years older than plants and animals, which is fungi they're strange own little things. And just like, and also like plants, like plants evolved, like from algae, which, the only real way they can photosynthesize was from a kind of like how mitochondria came into animal cells. Same thing with a cyanobacteria, which is like it's a kind of algae, and plants evolved from algae, and algae are like these mats, at the time before plants and animals. You have these mats of algae sitting at the top of the ocean, just like mats of this stuff. And at the bottom, you have, a bottom of shallow oceans, you have fungi and lichens and other like floor mat algae and like phytoplanktons and whatnot. And it's these kind of two like layers of life, and ever since like chemical evolution of proteins and stuff and the first life formed, these very thin layers where life can exist on Earth, in the universe. And in these little slight layers is unimaginable complexity. Even when you're talking about simple life like algae and microorganisms, unbelievable complexity. And even just like proteins, like individual proteins and chemical evolution and viruses, so much complexity. And that got me thinking about like all of the bacteria and microbes and all of those microbial ecosystems that we never even think about. Because think of it, like there's a bacteria or some kind of microorganism adapted to anything, because every little niche is something to be exploited. Every little situation or environmental factor, like we've got bacteria that are specialized to live in an environment with human cancer cells, either like against human cancer cells, like gaining like nutrients and like feed, like there's viruses that specifically attack human cancer cells, And then there's bacteria that specifically survive in, environments with human cancer cells and actually help the cancer cells. And it's like, that's such a niche little thing, and yet there's still multiple things, specialized in that area. And like, think of all the microbes and stuff that are evolving to other microbes and adapted to other microbes, in the ocean. It's just like their whole lifestyle. And then I don't quite remember how we got into this topic, but like, we've started talking about like fractals, and like you've seen those videos where it's like, mathematical patterns of like chaos, but on a really small part of the picture you can zoom in forever into like increase like extraordinary amounts of complexity in that one little area, and it just forms from chaos, from chance, because in a chaotic environment, everything's going every which way, and somewhere it's just right enough to keep going in this loop of complexity. And isn't that life? Isn't life like a universal fractal pattern where you zoom in on this tiny little spot on the picture in increasingly complexity and just unending complexity? And like, and all there's just like life, is a gradient. Like, we have these, like sectioned off terms to describe what we're talking about, like bacteria, animal cells, plant cells, viruses, and proteins. But in reality, it's a smooth color gradient with everything in between, and with a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Like, there's very complex viruses that are almost what we would call cells. Like, there's viruses that like have little simple metabolisms. If you want to go into this topic more, search up like gyruses and research that. It's very interesting. They even have like viruses that infect other viruses. And think of like all these like viruses that are just floating around and interacting between living things and cells, and all this DNA crossing back and forth and flowing, like, stealing little DNA traits from creatures and transferring to other creatures, and this flow between living things of this, like, just these floating organic particles, floating. And even like within our cells, like biochemistry is just a bunch of organic molecules floating around and bumping into each other and reacting. That's what it is. It's not, it is this incredible machine, but like, it's not like a machine that you would think of. It's just a machine of chance, like a little organic pot that, you put in the right ingredients in just the right way, it'll keep reproducing itself in just that right way. And things bumping into each other, and forming things and doing things. It's incredible. Like, within your cells, it's just a bunch of proteins that are floating around inside your cells until they, are electrically, molecularly attracted to, the protein, the other protein that, it's supposed to interact with. Because, proteins are just little puzzle pieces that just kind of electrically react to each other and form little other bigger protein puzzle pieces and do things and do all these complex work that cells do on a daily basis. And it's incredible. It's incredible. And I just love thinking about like organic chemistry and DNA and proteins as this fractal pattern within the universe. This universe is a chaos machine that just, on this little spot on the map, this little planet where temperature and chemistry and like chemical makeup and, and conditions were just right. There's, that it formed this little pattern that just kept going and kept zooming in and getting more complex and interacting with the world and flowing with that chaos and creating something new, something complex and almost orderly but still chaotic. And isn't that life? It's orderly, but it's chaos. It's chaos and order combined. And it's wonderful. We live in a wonderful, beautiful universe. And it is so beautiful that you and me exist in this little thin filament where we're possible, where you could just zoom in on you, this little individual of life, and then zoom in even more, your consciousness, your ability to perceive, your senses, your organs, zoom in a little more, your cells and all those complex protein machines. And it's so wonderful, and there's so much complexity to it all, like your immune system, how you metabolize things, how you think, how your cells work. It's mind-bending. It's unconceivable to us. And I think that's wonderful. And all of life started at this little filament where life was possible. And, that filament grew and grew as life, got more complex and stuff. Like, plants started out at the very, right along the coast, but, still in water, because it needed a hard, stable place to situate itself, but it also needed to be close to the surface, and that's where algae was, on the surface of the water, but also really close to the ground underneath it. And then it had to colonize deeper and deeper into the ocean, and then it had to colonize up on land as well, and spread out across this beautiful world. And still, with all of the places that life has explored, it's still this unimaginably small, thin layer on this planet. Just this little thin layer on this tiny little speck that exists within a grain of sand that is the Milky Way galaxy. It's incredible. It's incredible. And, just wow, universe. Wow. Look at the moon. Oh, I'm so glad we have a moon. Just to be able to look up at that every single day, every night. Can you imagine a world without that moon? I'm so glad I live with this one. I think the moon is one of my favorite objects, period. And you know, with its effect on the tides and stuff, it might have been integral in, you know, the evolution of life, the origins of life in that primordial soup. And that primordial soup came from outer space. It came from these rocks. If you haven't heard of like these sugar covered asteroids in the outer reaches of the solar system, where it's extremely cold and mostly everything is made of like ice, because you know, when you're like a degree away from absolute zero, pretty much all chemical compounds form ice. And you know, without like an ozone layer to protect it from ultraviolet radiation, these ice at extreme temperatures and, you know, exposed to UV radiation form simple sugars and amino acids, you know, sugars like glucose and other things, and all the amino acids that make up, you know, proteins and DNA can be found on these asteroids, on these comets. And, you know, the formation of Earth, a bunch of those rocks hit the Earth, and when the oceans formed, it cooled down and bumped together randomly, formed these little self-replicating entities and proteins randomly bumbling into each other, and eventually formed, you know, Luca, our last universal common ancestor between all life. And who knows, maybe it formed multiple different branches of life that just aren't around today, with only Luca surviving until now, or the ancestors of Luca surviving. We may never know. But I'm so glad at everything we do get to know. And there's still so much left to explore in this beautiful universe. My one and only wish is that my brain were big enough to comprehend it all, but I'm not sure if that's even possible, even physically possible. But anyway, that's all I wanted to share. You know, life is a universal fractal pattern of matter on this very thin little layer, on an indescribably tiny dot in this universe of chaos.